Political biographers, as I said, with a few exceptions, comprehensively ignore religion. Not because religion wasn't important to the prime ministers, but because it wasn't important to their biographers. So Ramsay MacDonald was the first Labour prime minister in the 1920s and 30s, and yet you'll read virtually nothing about his religious anguish, his decade as a Unitarian lay preacher in Kent and South London, or his dabbling in the world of spiritualism. And when religion is mentioned, the biographers frequently get it wrong. For example, the importance of faith to Harold Macmillan in his adult life, or the nature of his churchmanship. So I had to read all those biographers for the background and the leads they provided. Then there was a vast quantity of memoirs and edited diaries and correspondence, which were far more illuminating on matters of faith. I spent many hours poring over archives, manuscript material in archives. All the Prime Minister's papers, up to and including Macmillan, are accessible to the researcher. The archives of Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher can be viewed online. And in the earlier period, at least, people wrote at length about religious issues and personal faith because it was the subject matter of the day. They wrote without reserve because they never dreamt that one day the public would have access to their papers. Archival material dries up from the 1960s, but then it's replaced by newspaper interviews, magazine articles, and the opportunity to interview contemporaries and family members. Most families were delighted to help, if a little bemused by my interest. I met the descendants of Asquith, Bonar, Alec Douglas Hume. I corresponded with MacDonalds, Chamberlains, Macmillans, and Wilsons. I couldn't get any response from the Callahans, and despite Cherie telling me he would meet me, Tony Blair didn't reply to my letters. I didn't expect John Major to be interested, and therefore, to my surprise, I received back 9 pages of his spiritual musings. So there was no shortage of material, but how, as a parish priest, did I do it? Well, I don't play golf, I'm not a member of a gym, and I don't keep a dog. Research and writing were just for leisure hours only, undertaken late in the evening. Days off and holidays were organised around visits to archives and libraries. The pandemic provided more time for writing, but less opportunity for original research. But even I'm surprised that the book actually emerged after the space of 5 years. So what does the public expect of their premiers? The answer to that's probably very little by way of faith. If they thought about it at all, the 20th century public expected their prime ministers to be nominal Christians, Protestant of course, to have practiced faith privately if that suited them, and to kept their religious beliefs out of the public square. In this respect, Britain was very different from the United States, and we wanted to keep it that way. Prime ministers were generally reticent about discussing personal faith and religion. 2 exceptions were Stanley Baldwin and Tony Blair, and contemporaries criticised them for that. As James has said, Alistair Campbell famously declared, "We don't do God." That, however, indicated the fact that Blair did do God, rather too much for Campbell's liking. But the Prime Minister's reticence didn't indicate a lack of interest or practice. Rather, they were concerned not to alienate voters. A century or so ago, there was a huge divide between church, by which of course we mean Church of England, and chapel, about faith schools and other matters. Politicians were wary of losing votes. And then, to be fair to them, prime ministers wanted to avoid the charge of hypocrisy, preaching one thing and practicing another when it came to religion. So perhaps Margaret Thatcher isn't always regarded as a paragon of humility, but that was certainly a concern of hers. She maintained, "I would still regard myself as a religious person, although very, very, very much less perfect than I'd wish to be. I measure myself by my imperfections." Baldwin was one of the least reticent prime ministers. He infuriated his colleagues. One cabinet minister complained, A prime minister ought not to be tempted to stray too far into the regions of morals and imagination. And yet Baldwin has yielded far too easily to this temptation. To Cornish political meetings, he prefers to talk about Wesley than statesmanship. The Financial Times was also critical. They wrote, Baldwin was the first revivalist produced by the Tory party. We very much hope he'll be the last. But that was the reaction of a metropolitan elite. Baldwin's electoral record suggests the fact he was upfront about his Christianity didn't do him any harm with the population at large. So going a little bit beyond my period, having left office, Gordon Brown wrote of his regret that he hadn't spoken more openly of his strong religious beliefs. Gordon Brown said this: how can a public figure who holds convictions that are religious in origin be authentic if we don't state what influences we say and where we're coming from? To expect of those with strong convictions to leave them at the door of the House of Commons or number 10 is to require us to bring an incomplete version of ourselves into the public arena. I'd suggest that the public value authenticity over spin, and we need to encourage this. However you measure it, Britain certainly became a less Christian country during the 20th century. From the 1960s, there's been continual decline, precipitous from the 1990s, at least with respect to the traditional Christian churches, especially the Protestant denominations. One would expect the prime ministers to mirror that trend. And yet it's quite the reverse. Others have noted that late 20th century prime ministers were noticeably more Christian than the population as a whole. My study confirms that. That trend dates from the 1950s. It wasn't true before then. Of the 11 prime ministers in the first 50 years, only Baldwin was an uncomplicated Orthodox Christian. The rest were largely skeptics or bonkers. And then from Macmillan in 1957 onwards, all the prime ministers, except Jim Callaghan, would describe themselves as believing Christians. And in most cases, that was borne out by practice. So Baldwin's interesting. Faith, prayer, and scripture were fundamental to his personal and political life. He said that he felt, indeed he knew, that he had been chosen as God's instrument for the work of healing the nation. And he saw that in terms of ending the corruption he felt that Lloyd George had introduced into public life, and to healing the strife between social classes and in industry. And again, he declared publicly, he said he felt that if his work wasn't advancing the kingdom of God, I could have no hope, I could do no work, and I give up my office this morning to anyone who'd take it. Baldwin's faith informed his role at moments of national tension during the general strike in 1926, the abdication crisis in 1936. Baldwin used to like to present himself as a practical, ordinary Englishman. Therefore, the electorate might have been astonished had they known that he was experiencing mystical visions during his time in Downing Street. And yet Baldwin himself regarded such experiences simply as part of his willingness to allow himself to be led by God. So why did so few of the early prime ministers believe? I was surprised to discover how far skepticism had taken hold as early as the 1860s among the educated classes from whom the prime ministers were largely drawn. So Asquith was at Oxford in the early 1870s. A contemporary, someone he knew, wrote Supernatural Religion, a book sort of dismissing the claims of religion, was read by undergraduates who scored it to show how the old dogmas, the truth of miracles, the infallibility of the Bible, the claims of supernatural revelation were entirely discredited among the thinkers and those true religious leaders of the day, the men of science. Thus, undergraduates in Hall sneered at the Hebrew mythology. And if any scholar of Balliol or a university prizeman was a Christian or contemplated taking orders, he was regarded as a freak. So that's the intellectual climate in which most early 20th century prime ministers were raised. What caused that collapse in belief amongst the educated classes? That passage referred to the men of science. Yes, Darwin and other scientific advances were problematic for Protestants, whose faith was based on the Bible alone, when it seemed that science disproved a literal interpretation of Genesis and creation. Balfour devoted his life to the attempt, he wrote, to resolve the so-called conflict between religion and science. And yet, even as Balfour began writing in the late 1870s, a lot of the heat had gone out of that debate. I haven't discovered a single prime minister whose faith was destroyed or even substantially weakened by modern scientific discoveries. Neville Chamberlain venerated Darwin, but that didn't account for Chamberlain's agnosticism. Clement Attlee's family were committed Anglicans from Putney, who found no difficulty in fitting the theory of evolution into their belief system. So science wasn't the problem. Far more damaging to Orthodox Christian faith was the biblical criticism coming out of Germany in the early 19th century. That sought to separate the Christ of history from the Christ of faith. It argued that much of the Bible, any attempt to see Jesus as more than a reforming rabbi, was a later invention of the church. And to a large extent, it's all the fault of the French. All the early prime ministers read someone called Ernest Renan. Renan was a former seminarian whose anti-Catholicism and anti-clericalism appealed to Protestant Victorian England. His Life of Jesus was published in 1863, and it ran through dozens of editions. It was particularly beguiling because he claimed impartiality. He wrote with first-hand experience of the Holy Land, and his style was compelling. And yet he systematically gutted the Gospels of any supernatural content. So no miracles, no resurrection, no divinity of Christ. Christianity, he argued without much basis in fact, was merely the invention of that villain, St. Paul. Lloyd George and Ramsay MacDonald swallowed Renan's propaganda uncritically. They thought that Christ was just a moral example, just a good man. Churchill also read Renan, and in 1943, he interviewed Geoffrey Fisher for the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. Not unreasonably, Churchill asked Fisher if he'd read Renan. Fisher replied he hadn't. Churchill expressed his surprise, finding it quite unthinkable that a senior churchman was unacquainted with one of Christianity's greatest critics. And it was a damning admission. The church's failure to provide a convincing intellectual apologetic probably accounts to a significant extent for the skepticism of a number of the early premiers. Macmillan later had to prompt Fisher's successor as Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsay, to write a response to the cause célèbre of the 1960s, Honest to God, the book by John Robinson, the Anglican Bishop of Woolwich. And again, just think about that. You've got the Archbishop, you've got the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, urging the Archbishop of Canterbury to write to believers refuting this attack on faith or perceived attack on faith. Attacks by Renan and others on the divinity of Christ and belief in the resurrection didn't make their readers any happier. These skeptical prime ministers of the early 20th century are characterized by an overwhelming sense of sadness. It's as if they felt they'd been robbed of something precious. Particularly, they lamented the loss of the assurance of personal survival for their loved ones after death. If they could no longer believe in the resurrection, they felt constrained to seek comfort elsewhere. Above all, they bought into the spiritualism that was prevalent in the period. So Balfour's interest in the ghost world dates back to his undergraduate days in Cambridge. His involvement became more pronounced after the deaths of his mother and his fiancée. There were seances in Downing Street and elsewhere. He founded the Society for Psychical Research, which sought to determine scientific grounds for psychical phenomena. The ghosts weren't politically neutral. Those ghosts who made contact with Balfour were all Conservatives. Those ghosts that made contact with Ramsay MacDonald were Labour. Ramsay MacDonald declared himself a rationalist in religion, and that simply doesn't square with his involvement in the spirit world after the deaths of his wife and infant son. Anthony Eden's mother consulted a medium. Attler's wife participated in a séance in Downing Street. Churchill, surprisingly, had an astrologist whose predictions he brought to the cabinet table. So Margot Asquith was the second wife of the Liberal Prime Minister, someone who was extremely outspoken, something of a Marmite figure. Margot Asquith was a Christian and a no-nonsense Scot. She had no time for the occult. She wrote, "I don't believe in spiritualism at all. The idea that the existence of God either outside or within oneself can be proved by a few stray boxes on the air after dark is to me repugnant." So the factors which led to skepticism in the earlier period are obvious. What accounts for the return to faith in the later period? That's less apparent. We may think it's because the later prime ministers tended to be more middle class, the type more likely to be in church or chapel on a Sunday. But analysis doesn't bear that out. Two of the most devout prime ministers were Macmillan and Douglas Hume, old Etonian grandees. Attlee was solidly middle class, and yet a practical atheist. Some of the least believing or least orthodox were from the least privileged backgrounds: Lloyd George, MacDonald, and Callaghan. Heath and Thatcher were from only marginally higher social backgrounds, but both were committed Christians. So social class isn't a significant factor in explaining the likelihood of religious belief. Were the later prime ministers perhaps reacting against the loss of faith in progress, the experience of 2 world wars and the ideologies of the late 20th century? Again, there's no clear evidence for this. Churchill, Attlee, Eden, and Macmillan all experienced the horrors of the First World War, but they all held very different religious views. Macmillan's deep Christian faith survived the trenches of the First World War, but it wasn't formed there. Edward Heath and Callaghan both served in the Second War, and yet their respective positions as Orthodox Anglican and practical atheist remained unchanged by their experience of war. One factor militating against faith among the early prime ministers was the sheer boredom of the Puritan Victorian Sunday. 40 years on, Asquith was still haunted by the visions of hellfire preached in his piously educated childhood. He feared that heaven would be like his West Yorkshire chapel. Lloyd George was raised by his uncle, a Welsh Baptist preacher, in an intensely religious home, and his reaction was similar. He said, "When I was a boy, the thought of heaven used to frighten me more than the thought of hell. I pictured heaven as a place where there would be perpetual Sundays with perpetual services from which there'd be no escape." Lloyd George adored his uncle, but he loathed the time he was forced to spend in chapel, and that contributed to his dramatic loss of faith at an early age. Gradually, Puritan practices were relaxed. Douglas Hume's experience of faith was moderate and sensible. Macmillan had to battle with his mother in order to practice as an Anglo-Catholic in his youth. Margaret Thatcher's faith seems to have been saved by the death of her grandmother, which led to the lifting of the restrictions in their Grantham home. Interesting, the one non-believer of the later period, Callaghan, was raised in a very strict Baptist family. Sigmund Freud argued that religion is a human invention. God is simply the projection of the need for a father figure. Religious belief declines as the authority of the human father is rejected. Paul Vitz is a Catholic, an American psychologist who's turned Freud's theory on its head. Vitz contends that psychology actually helps explain atheism. He argues that in most instances, atheism is the result of what he calls a deficient father, by which he means a father who died or was otherwise absent during a person's formative years, or with whom they had a bad relationship. And he illustrates his claim by reference to the bad relationships various prominent atheists had with their fathers. So although a very small sample, my book supports Witz's hypothesis. Of the 19 prime ministers, only Attlee enjoyed a good relationship with his father and was still a non-believer. The 9 prime ministers who lost their fathers during childhood or were physically or emotionally distanced from them were atheists, agnostics, or lacked a strong faith. Baldwin, Douglas, Hume, and Thatcher enjoyed close relationships with their fathers and strongly identified as Christians. Almost to emphasize the point, the 2 other strongly Christian prime ministers, Macmillan and Blair, might not have had particularly close relationships with their fathers, but they compensated for this by having significant male mentors who influenced their religious development. Ronnie Knox in the case of Macmillan, and the Australian cleric, Peter Thompson, for Blair. So what did faith look like for our prime ministers? For most of the period, it was a given that those holding the highest office of state would be at least nominally Protestant. The establishment could accept an agnostic or an atheist, but not a Catholic or believing non-Christian. So Rishi Sunak's Hinduism doesn't seem to have counted against him as our first non-Christian prime minister. And yet I suggest that as recently as the 1990s, it was difficult to conceive of a Hindu or Muslim prime minister. We tend to think of this country as predominantly Church of England a century ago. And yet it's surprising how few real Anglicans there were in the early 20th century. Only Baldwin. Campbell Bannerman was a Presbyterian, the first prime minister not even to be nominally Anglican. Asquith was raised Congregationalist, Lloyd George Baptist, Law and MacDonald Presbyterian again. Churchill, Attlee and Eden were baptized and confirmed Anglicans, but faith barely featured in their adult lives. Chamberlain came from a Unitarian family and loosely identified as a Protestant nonconformist. Macmillan was the strongest churchman in Downing Street since Gladstone and Salisbury. Douglas Hume was a committed Christian, but impatient of denominational differences. Wilson grew up in Baptist and Congregationalist chapels, but while sympathetic, largely ceased to practice. Heath was Church of England. Callaghan abandoned the Baptist faith of his youth. Margaret Thatcher effectively moved from Methodism to Anglicanism. Major was a baptized Anglican who, in his own words, remained a believer at a distance. Blair was an Anglican who, of course, practiced as a Catholic following his marriage to Cherie and converted after leaving office. A variety of backgrounds and practice, but a good deal of similarity when it came to the expression of faith. It was overwhelmingly Protestant. Most of our prime ministers were conversant with the Bible. They had read it regularly at home, in Sunday school, and in church or chapel. In the early period, the emphasis was on the Old Testament rather than the New. MacDonald and Attlee complained about having to memorize lists of dates, places, and figures from the Old Testament. In contrast, Baldwin, Macmillan, and Blair focused on Christ and the Gospels, and all 3 received spiritual solace from their regular reading of Scripture, which wasn't necessarily true for the other prime ministers. It's more difficult to capture the prayer life of the prime ministers. For most, one suspects prayer was rather perfunctory, at best the rather formal act of saying one's prayers. Many of the early prime ministers were raised in homes where there was formal daily prayer for the entire household. A few took personal prayer more seriously. That was true for Baldwin, who spoke movingly of how so much of his life was spent learning to say with conviction that one petition of the Lord's Prayer, "Thy will be done." Macmillan occasionally let slip references to his prayer life. So, for example, when the partial test ban treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union was signed in 1963, seeking to limit nuclear weapons, Macmillan revealed that that was something he'd been praying for profoundly, night after night. Blair also acknowledged the importance of daily prayer in his life. Going back to Margot Asquith, she cynically observed that the upper classes went to church simply to set a good example to the servants. I don't believe that's true. The middle classes might have attended church to keep up appearances. Generally speaking, the upper classes couldn't care less what others thought about their religious practice. Asquith said his belief and practice were no one's business other than his own. Lloyd George felt obliged to appear a good chapel-going Baptist when back in Wales, but Chamberlain, Churchill, Attlee and Eden weren't regular churchgoers by any stretch of the imagination, and they suffered no adverse electoral consequences. When the Prime Ministers practiced faith, the emphasis was on scripture, preaching and music, whether prayer book Anglicanism or a chapel service. Liturgy, not a word they would have used, was judged on the quality of the sermon and the singing. And that's not something to be belittled. Edward Heath was notoriously difficult in his relationship with others. He was, however, an accomplished musician, and the clergy at Salisbury Cathedral felt music provided him with an access to spiritual vision and enlightenment. With the exception of Macmillan, doctrine and sacraments don't feature largely in their spiritual lives. All the Prime Ministers were baptized, except Chamberlain and possibly Asquith. For most of them, baptism was just seen as a social rite of passage. As a young man, Lloyd George scandalized his Welsh contemporaries by claiming baptism was neither necessary nor desirable for salvation. Margaret Thatcher said she'd had her children baptized as Methodists, but they didn't do the water thing. So quite what's happening there is, or what she thought was happening is interesting to understand. Even less emphasis was given to the Eucharist. Lloyd George's Baptist chapel celebrated the Eucharist regularly, and yet he dismissed it as an imposing farce. Interestingly, Lloyd George was more easily moved by the emotions and spoke of the presence he encountered at Mass in the Vatican and Westminster Cathedral. Churchill received Holy Communion only once in his life, when he was confirmed at school at Harrow. And although practicing as an Anglican after her marriage to Dennis, Margaret Thatcher never received communion in the Church of England. Coming from low church, Anglican, Presbyterian, or nonconformist backgrounds, the Prime Ministers were religiously representative of 20th century Britain, or at least as the establishment would like to have presented it. I was asked in one interview whether being a Catholic priest influenced the content and approach of the book. Of course, I wrote as a priest, but there's no way I could make this a Catholic book, even had I wished to do so. Only two Prime Ministers, Macmillan and Blair, had any substantive contact with Catholicism. Jim Callaghan's father was a Catholic who left the church when refused permission to marry his Baptist wife. Together with anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism was the socially acceptable prejudice of the period. Catholicism was seen as unpatriotic, a restriction on intellectual freedom. Balfour wrote that he loathed Catholicism. Campbell Bannerman expressed his intense dislike of the idea of a mediating priesthood standing between the individual and his creator. Although, to be fair to the Prime Ministers, they loathed High Church Anglicanism just as much as they did Roman Catholicism. Anthony Eden admitted, "I haven't much love for the Church of Rome." Now, that was a massive understatement. He had an irrational hatred of Catholicism, the result of his sense of national and aesthetic superiority. Eden declared Islam was preferable to Catholicism. I'm afraid the Catholic novelist Evelyn Waugh didn't help matters much. In 1952, Anthony Eden, a divorcee, married Churchill's niece, Clarissa Churchill, a cradle Catholic. And after a particularly good lunch at his club, Waugh wrote to Clarissa asking how it felt to betray her Lord on Calvary in marrying Eden. Clarissa didn't reply. Often the agnostics or atheists were in fact more tolerant towards Catholicism than the practicing Anglicans and Presbyterians. Presumably they felt that one form of revealed religion was no better or worse than any other. Neville Chamberlain was surprisingly relaxed when family members converted to Catholicism. And when a great-nephew became a Jesuit novice, Attlee commented tersely, "Better a Catholic priest than a communist." So Boris was our first Catholic Prime Minister, at least as a matter of canon law. Blair only became a Catholic after he left office. In spring 1915, Harold Macmillan, a young infantry officer preparing to leave for the trenches of the First World War, told his friends he was about to convert to Catholicism. Macmillan was a protege of Ronnie Knox when Knox was still a very high Anglican. Macmillan was enchanted by what he called the Catholic liturgy and spirituality, to which Knox introduced him. It was based on prayer and a genuine desire for holiness. Macmillan served Knox's Mass and went to confession. So what prevented Macmillan following through and becoming a Roman Catholic? Biographers claim it was fear of his family's reaction and his own political ambition. Yes, Macmillan's mother was a bigoted American Methodist, but he'd already defied her in continuing his friendship with Ronnie Knox. Becoming a Catholic would have ended his chances of being Prime Minister, but Macmillan's political ambitions were not highly developed at that stage. More important was the departure for active service of his Oxford friend Guy Lawrence, whose commitment to conversion was stronger than Macmillan's. Also, facing the prospect of imminent death on the Western Front, Macmillan's mind was in a real whirl, and he felt it would have been almost sacrilege to have undertaken such a serious step as conversion when unable to think clearly. After the First World War, there was never any serious suggestion that Macmillan would become a Catholic, but he remained fascinated by Catholicism. He delighted in church gossip with the Jesuits over the lunch table at Farm Street. In his diaries, Macmillan refers to Downing Street as the Vatican and to Chequers as Castle Gandolfo. Having successfully appointed his candidate to Canterbury over the wishes of the outgoing Archbishop, Macmillan tried to achieve the same thing with Pope John XXIII when Westminster became vacant on Cardinal Godfrey's death. Rome was having none of it. Macmillan did, however, have a good grasp of doctrine and liturgy. Eden acidly remarked of Macmillan that he should have been a cardinal in the Middle Ages under a strong pope. We tend to forget that Tony Blair is, in fact, half Irish. His mother's family were Protestant farmers from Donegal. His grandfather was Grand Master of the local Orange Lodge. Blair's grandmother asked him to promise never to marry a Catholic. Blair's interest in religion was awakened by his encounter at Oxford with the charismatic Australian Anglican priest, Peter Thompson. It's from that point onward that faith became central to his life, more important, he wrote, than politics. It was Cherie who insisted the family practice at St. Joan of Arc, Highbury, to give the children the experience of normal community life. And Blair happily went along with that decision, there and in his constituency. It was important to him that they practiced as a family. But Blair also frequently attended Mass alone. And he was criticised by the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, for doing so. We remember that Cardinal Hume had to ask him to refrain from receiving communion. And yet Blair avoided questions about possible conversion. So why did Blair convert, and why at that particular time? Friends said he resented being excluded from receiving communion with his family. He appreciated the sense of community and inclusion he found in the Catholic Church. Canon Timothy Russ, parish priest at Chequers, said Blair found in the average Catholic parish the diverse and socially engaged community he wanted the Labour Party to be. It's less clear where Blair sat in terms of doctrine, ecclesiology, and moral theology. There's another possible factor. Blair was a curious mixture of conformist and rebel. And I wonder whether he didn't relish the thought of the reaction his conversion to Catholicism would have caused his atheist father and his Protestant family in Donegal. Blair's reception into the church on the 21st of December 2007 wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. He'd been attending Mass regularly for a generation. His audiences with John Paul II were significant steps. And he said that he felt that his reception was a completely logical step. He candidly acknowledged the problems becoming a Catholic would have caused while in office, not least with the Northern Irish peace process and his role in the appointment of Anglican bishops. And as soon as the timetable for his resignation became clear, he took steps to begin his reception into the church. And Cardinal Murphy O'Connor deputed Mark O'Toole to accompany him. Earlier generations had feared that a Catholic Prime Minister would take their instructions from the Pope. So, reviewing the book, Tim Stanley points out the irony that it was precisely the one Prime Minister who became a Catholic who didn't follow the Pope's advice when Blair took the UK into the Gulf War. Has faith influenced the policies and decisions of our Prime Ministers? In a few instances, that may be true, but not many. More significantly, it influenced the people they were, and in some ways, their aptitude for office. It makes a difference if one believes that one must ultimately account to God for one's actions, if one treats all persons from conception to natural death as fundamentally equal in the eyes of their Creator, if one sees public life from a wider perspective. Faith also provides a sense of resilience and balance. I was struck by the desperate sadness and depression of Law, MacDonald, and Churchill, caused by their inability to believe, to accept the hope of eternal life. By contrast, Baldwin was a benign and humane figure in consequence of his belief that he had a divinely appointed mandate to be a healer in national life. Prayer, scripture, and the sacraments provided Macmillan with the strength needed to sustain war wounds and a tragic family life. Faith in God makes a difference for the better. As the 20th century progressed, the Prime Ministers increasingly came to appreciate this. And Tony Blair is right to say that those who in his youth predicted the imminent demise of religion in public life have been proved quite wrong. So what next for me? Having written up the 19 Prime Ministers of the 20th century, I'm turning my attention now to the 19 Prime Ministers of the 19th century. I've been pressed to write on the religion of the 21st century Prime Ministers, but I don't think that a priest should be a political commentator. Also, a year ago, I thought there weren't enough 21st century Prime Ministers to justify another volume. I'm afraid I've been proved quite wrong. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, Father Mark, thank you very much indeed. And I'm quite a cliffhanger to end on there in terms of, yes, Prime Ministers of this century. Please do keep your questions coming in on the Q&A function, and I can put some of those to Father Mark now, who's agreed to take some questions. Listening to your talk, Father Mark, I was struck by the fact that the faith of Prime Minister seems to get stronger as you go through last century. You offered some suggestions as to why that might be, but there seems to be no single reason for it. Have you got any particular thought as to why that might be the case?
Well, as I said, I think it's a combination of factors, and I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which people reacted against these sorts of Victorian Puritans of Sunday, the restrictions that particularly Protestants and Protestant nonconformists had to endure, and the way that people reacted against that. And it is telling, it's those who had the strictest upbringings who tended to react against faith, and then those restrictions were relaxed. People tended not to react against faith. So for example, I mentioned Margaret Thatcher. She had a sister, an older sister, who I think basically gave up on faith as a result of and they called it their bigoted Methodist upbringing. So no music, no newspapers, not allowed even to walk with friends on a Sunday. a lot of this was enforced by their Methodist grandmother. And so it informed a lot of the childhood of Margaret Thatcher's elder sister. The grandmother died when Margaret Thatcher was quite young. So I think it's that restriction, the lessening of the restrictions that probably saved Margaret Thatcher's faith. So that's one reason. A lot of the heat went out of the intellectual arguments after the First World War. So I think there are various reasons.
Okay. Well, as a bit of a primer for your next book, somebody's asked if you could talk about the faith of Disraeli,
yes,
going back to the 19th century. I know that you've begun investigations into him. What have you found so far?
No, I could talk quite a bit about Disraeli. He's reputed to have said that he was the blank page between the Old Testament and the New. So we were saying earlier that he came from a Jewish family. He was circumcised. His father had a row with the synagogue when the children were young, and he took the children off and had them baptized as nominal Anglicans. A lot of Disraeli's contemporaries felt that he was cynical when it came to religion. He's got a remarkable understanding, and he appreciates religion as a major social factor. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. Also, the thing that astonished me was going back and reading his novels. I read a couple when I was younger, but I've gone back and read the rest of them, is the extent to which religion features. And I think as Catholics, we'd do well to go back and read, if we haven't done, his novel Lothair, which was published in 1870, which is basically a critique of Cardinal Manning. He's fascinated by religion. And also, from his own perspective, it's quite extraordinary that the religion he talks about is not Anglicanism. He talks all the time about Judaism and Catholicism, which I thought was a surefire way of losing yourself votes as a Protestant, leader of the Tory party, a Protestant party in the mid-20th century. So there's a real fascination there. Also, I was in Hughenden last week, and the library there is stuffed full of works of theology. Not just on the shelves, we know that he read those works as well. He was very guarded about this, but I think he was much more open to and influenced by a lot of those works of German modernist theology that I was talking about earlier than he would have let on. But Disraeli is fascinating. So a real understanding, a real fascination, but I don't think there's actually much personal spiritual engagement.
Interesting. Okay. Well, somebody's asked whether you thought Tony Blair's experience of negotiating the Northern Ireland peace process had any impact on his decision to convert to Catholicism, either in terms of delaying it or in terms of the final decision to convert.
Certainly in terms of timing, yes. He said that becoming a Catholic while he's Prime Minister would just been a whole bunch of trouble that he could live without. And it's one of the factors that influenced his decision not to become a Catholic until after he'd left office. I don't think it influenced his decision one way or another to become a Catholic. I think that was largely being formed before the Northern Irish peace process began. One of the interesting things about the Northern Irish peace process and faith for Blair was the unlikely friendship he struck up with Ian Paisley. And Paisley knew, of course, that Blair was married to a Catholic, that he went to Mass. And yet, as soon as they stopped talking politics, they'd be straight onto religion, and they were exchanging books with each other, books on religion. And there was real engagement centered on faith between Blair and Paisley. So surprisingly, it did actually help that personal relationship. He struck up with Paisley.
Interesting. And in terms of reasons for not becoming Catholic in office, you mentioned Boris, certainly in the eyes of the church, being seen as a Catholic, but he continued to approve or to recommend the appointment of Anglican bishops during his time in office.
No,
or did he not? Or did he?
No. So there was an argument. Gordon Brown was a son of the Manse. His father was a Church of Scotland minister. And Brown said he wanted nothing to do with, he thought it was inappropriate for him to be involved in the appointment of Anglican bishops. So he withdrew from that. there was still a nominal role, even after the time of Brown, that the Prime Minister was effectively passing the envelope between the Church Appointments Committee and Buckingham Palace. And there was still an argument, and they were uncertain about this. They took advice that some of the provisions of the 1829 Emancipation Act were still on the statute book, and that might still have constituted a Prime Minister giving the sovereign advice. And the 1829 Emancipation Act still said a papist couldn't advise the sovereign on ecclesiastical matters. So that was repealed. And there's now no involvement of the Prime Minister in nominating Anglican bishops. And up until the time of Callahan's, they had a very real role. They could initiate a candidature up until the time of Callahan. After that, the Church of England put forward two names, and so the Prime Minister still had the power to reverse the order of those names or to send both of them back and tell the Church of England to go back and think again. And it's said that both Thatcher and Blair exercised that power. So it's only very recently that the Prime Minister has withdrawn completely from any role in the appointment of Anglican bishops.
Interesting. And on that point, who out of the Prime Ministers you've looked at so far, would you say that their faith has influenced their decision-making and their time in Number 10?
It's often the less believing ones who got more involved in the process. And so two people who are fascinated by the appointment of bishops and really did get involved were Asquith, who grew up a Congregationalist, in a vague sense converted to Anglicanism, but there wasn't much belief there. And he really did get involved. And so his criteria for a good Anglican bishop was a good scholar. So he tended to recommend people who'd been at Balliol with him at Oxford, or that mould. Clement Attlee as well. Clement Attlee was effectively an atheist, but again, fascinated by the process of the appointment of Anglican bishops and took real care. So 1945, he's elected to office. Second World War has just finished. There's a massive job of rebuilding Europe and this country. The Labour Party is a platform of nationalisation, decolonisation. Attlee spends a huge amount of his time chatting to the Archbishop of Canterbury, to the Archbishop of York, and putting forward very strongly his views on who should be a bishop. And his views were they should be younger men, they should be men who had more pastoral experience. He wanted less canon lawyers and less experts, less academics. So it's fascinating. And often the believers felt that as laymen, it wasn't their job to be advising the church. You've got the situation where the non-believers got more involved, but they still took it seriously. And I didn't come across any instances of prime ministers, I think, abusing their situation. All of them were determined to do right by the church and the country, in terms of the nomination of bishops.
And what would you say was your biggest surprise researching the book, in terms of somebody who you thought might have had quite a strong faith, who turns out from your research didn't, or vice versa, somebody who actually appeared to be quite blasé about it, but perhaps did have quite strong faith after all?
So I think one surprise was I came away thinking that the 18 men and one woman were far more decent people than I'd expected, than perhaps the public thinks their prime ministers are.
Well, that's encouraging.
No, and seriously, they were fundamentally decent people. I'd make one exception, and a very strong exception, in the case of Lloyd George. And I knew little about this, but I was horrified to discover how far it went. Lloyd George, despite being brought up in a very strict Welsh Baptist context, was a real rogue and a thoroughly bad piece of work. And actually, he lost his faith about the age of 11 or 12. He describes that very dramatically. But at every level, he was financially corrupt. We know about these honours scandals. And okay, other people did that, and other people tended to fund their political parties with the proceeds. With Lloyd George, it all went into his back pocket. he was essentially a bigamist, and so in public he appeared with his wife. We know that he was having an affair and also took private vows with his secretary, Francis Stevenson, and really nasty man. He forced her to have 2 abortions. He forced her to enter a suicide pact. So that's was an unpleasant surprise. On the other side, again, I knew that Macmillan came close to conversion to Catholicism as a young man. I wasn't prepared for the depth of his faith. He was a real man of prayer. He understood faith, and it influenced him. Douglas Hume as well. Fundamentally, very, very good man. Douglas Hume suffered in the early 1940s. He had a spinal condition that meant that he was encased in plaster for about 2 years, and they weren't sure he was going to survive. And his faith really deepened during that time, and he was sustained by faith. And without making a huge fuss about it, he would talk to publicly a bit about how faith was everything to him, how it underpinned his political program, how it made him the person he was. And other surprises, and Churchill's real sadness and not being able to believe. I think Churchill wanted to believe, but couldn't. One of the last visitors to Churchill as an elderly prime minister was the young Billy Graham. So Billy Graham pleaded with him, and they prayed together, but Churchill simply couldn't believe. Quintin Hogg, Lord Hailsham, went to visit Churchill towards the end of Churchill's life, and again he pleaded with him. Said, look, you prayed during the Boer War, and that seemed to help. Can't you come back to faith? And he said he left that meeting in tears. He felt that Churchill's soul was clad in dust and ashes. So, yeah, and Margaret Thatcher as well. I was surprised how strong her faith was. One of her biographers says we forget that she was a preacher before she was a politician. Margaret Thatcher was a lay preacher, lay Methodist preacher during her time as an undergraduate at Oxford. So lots of surprises, and I really do urge people to read the book, and mainly for that reason, because it shows how political biographers, academia, mainstream media have ignored the faith of our prime ministers. And you can't understand them. You can't understand them without knowing that context of faith.
Okay, well, I shall put the link to your book in the chat once more for people to have a look. As a final question, and perhaps a look ahead to the sequel. I know that you don't want to be a political commentator in terms of commenting on the faith of quite recent prime ministers, but there are already quite a few for you to look at. And someone has asked about the faith of Theresa May and Liz Truss. Plenty to keep you busy there.
Okay, well, the comment I'd make is that even where in the 20th century, prime ministers lacked faith, I think the ethics survived. And in fact, Clement Attlee said quite explicitly, he said Christianity, I reject the mumbo jumbo, by which he meant the doctrine, but I accept the ethics. And being raised in Christian homes, whether they personally were believers or not, I think massively influenced the 20th century prime ministers. And that's why I think most of them were fundamentally decent people. And yet even they themselves, including Margaret Thatcher, said, you can't cut the flower from its roots. You can't keep the Christian ethics without the Christian belief, without the underlying personal faith. And perhaps that's what we're beginning to see. So, okay, going on to the 21st century, because I do just touch on this in the conclusion, it does continue, and more than you perhaps think. Gordon Brown talks about his strong religious convictions, and he said, again, as I said, he regretted that he didn't talk more openly about that during his time in office. David Cameron identifies as an Anglican. Theresa May, of course, came from a very strongly Christian background. Her father was an Anglo-Catholic priest. I think they go to church every Sunday. a fundamentally decent woman, influenced by faith. And she doesn't like talking about it. She's quite reticent. But she appeared on Desert Island Discs, and again she said, you can't understand me without my faith." Liz Truss, I don't think there's much that can be said, and I think at an earlier point in life, she said she was an atheist, and then I think standing for office, running for leadership of the Conservative Party, she decided she was Anglican tradition. So I'm not sure quite what's there. Boris is fascinating, because he's got the vocabulary. He's also got the most varied political pedigree of any prime minister. He's got a Jewish great-grandparent, a Muslim great-grandparent, Catholic, Anglican great-grandparents. And again, a bit like Disraeli, he understands, I think, so he's got the vocabulary, he can talk about this. So I don't know whether you saw the interview with Robert Peston when they were down in Cornwall for the summit there. And this is the time of Boris's rather slightly controversial wedding in Westminster Cathedral. So Peston asks Boris, "So have you become a practicing Roman Catholic now?" And Boris dismisses him rather harshly, saying "I don't answer such deep questions, particularly with people like you." And Peston comes back and says, "Well, what's the problem?" So Keir Starmer is happy to say that he's an atheist. And straight back, without pausing, Boris comes back and quotes the Psalms as "Oh, it's the foolish man who says in his heart that there is no God." And when he has been challenged, Boris has said that he's a Christian. But then I think we'd want to say, "Well, come on, show us how that has any bearing in practice." And then you've got a prime minister in office today, Rishi Sunak, who doesn't make a great fuss about his faith, but will say that religion is incredibly important to him. I'm told that there's a shrine in Downing Street now, a Hindu shrine. I'm told that he's quite happy going to his local Anglican church in his constituency. So someone for whom, again, faith is important.
Very interesting. Okay, Father Mark. Well, after the prequel, it sounds like there's more than enough material for the sequel. Thank you again for joining us. A really, really fascinating talk. And I'd encourage those on the call, if you haven't tracked down a copy yet, there is a link in the chat where you can find it. Thank you again for joining us this evening. If you have not signed up to our weekly briefing, please do so online. You can be kept up to date on our work and future events. Do please consider becoming a member of the Catholic Union. For £30 a year, you can support our work and make sure we can put on more events like this, or make a one-off donation. There are details on our website if you take a look. But for this evening, Father Mark, thank you once again. Thank you to everyone who took part. I look forward to seeing you at a future event again soon. Thanks again.
Thank you.